Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. Tonight, the most famous face in Hollywood is about to say 4 words on live television that will make Johnny Carson forget he is on camera. 4 words that will silence a studio of 300 people. 4 words that Cary Grant has never said out loud in front of anyone, not in 30 years of being the most recognized man in America. And when he finally says them, what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about the man who invented charm itself. But before we begin, I want to ask you something. If you have been watching this channel and you have not yet subscribed, take one moment right now and check. It is free, it costs you nothing, and it is the reason we are able to keep telling stories like this one. Thank you for being here. Now, let's go back. There is a thing that happens when you watch enough old footage of Cary Grant. You start to notice something that should not be possible. He never looks uncomfortable. Not once. Not in a single frame of a single interview across 30 years of public life. He sits with his legs crossed and his jacket perfect, and his smile arriving exactly when it should, and he makes you feel that wherever he is, that is the most natural place in the world to be. Journalists described interviewing him as being interviewed yourself. You walked in with questions and walked out having answered all of them. He had that quality, the quality of making space around him feel safe, because he was so completely at ease inside it, which is why what happened on The Tonight Show in the autumn of 1968 has never been fully explained. Because for 47 seconds, Cary Grant was not at ease. For 47 seconds, the most polished man in the history of Hollywood sat in a chair across from Johnny Carson and could not speak. Not because he had forgotten what to say, not because the question was difficult, because the question was the simplest question anyone had asked him in 30 years, and he had no idea how to answer it. Johnny Carson had looked at him, pen resting on his note card, studio lights warm overhead, 300 people waiting in the dark, and said 4 words, just 4 words, tell me about yourself. And Cary Grant had gone still. What happened in those 47 seconds, and what came after them, is the story we are going to tell tonight. But to understand it, we have to go back much further than 1968. We have to go back to a street in Bristol, England, in 1914. And we have to meet a boy that nobody in that Tonight Show studio had ever heard of, a boy named Archie. Archibald Alexander Leach was born on January 18, 1904, in a terraced house on Hughenden Road in Bristol, England. His father Elias was a garment presser. His mother Elsie was a woman who laughed easily and cried in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. Archie was their only surviving child. A brother had died in infancy before Archie could remember him, and from his earliest years, Archie understood something that most children are protected from understanding, that the people who are supposed to stay do not always stay. His mother was beautiful. He knew that the way children know things about beautiful parents, not from being told but from watching other people look at her. She had dark eyes and soft hands, and she smelled like lavender water, and she was the center of everything Archie knew about the world being good. And then one morning when Archie was 9 years old, she was not there. He came downstairs for breakfast and his father was at the table and his mother was not. His father said she had gone away for a rest. He said she would be back soon. He poured Archie's tea and went back to his newspaper, and that was the end of the conversation. Archie went to school. He came home. His mother was not there. He went to school the next day. She was not there. Weeks passed. She was not there. What Archie did not know, what his father never told him, was that Elsie Leach had been committed to a mental institution. She had not gone for a rest. She had been taken, and she would not come back. Not for years, not until Archie was already gone. He was 9 years old and his mother had disappeared, and no one would tell him why. And in the absence of explanation, a 9-year-old boy arrives at the only explanation available to him, that it was something to do with him, that he had not been enough to make her stay. This is the thing that nobody knew about Cary Grant. Not the journalists who interviewed him, not the directors who worked with him, not the 5 women he married. The most charming man in the world learned charm as a survival skill. He learned how to make rooms comfortable because he had once lived in a room from which all the comfort had been removed, and he had decided that he would never feel that way again if there was anything he could do about it. But wait, because the story of how Archie Leach became Cary Grant is not a simple story of reinvention. It is a story about what you leave behind when you reinvent yourself, and what you leave behind has a way of following you. At 13, Archie joined a traveling acrobatic troupe called the Bob Pender Stage Troupe. He had auditioned on a dare, half expecting to be turned away, and had instead been taken on as an apprentice. He learned to walk on stilts. He learned to fall without getting hurt. He learned that audiences will believe anything if you commit to it completely. These were skills that would serve him for the rest of his life, in ways that had nothing to do with acrobatics. The troupe toured England, and then, in 1920, sailed to New York. Archie was 16. He had almost no money, and no connections, and no plan beyond not going back. America was loud and vertical, and it smelled like possibility and exhaust, and he loved it immediately, with the uncomplicated love of someone who has nothing to lose. He stayed when the troupe went home. He took odd jobs. He sold neckties. He performed in vaudeville. He was hungry enough, often enough, that hunger became ordinary. He did not go back. By the mid-1920s, he was on Broadway. By 1931, he was in Hollywood. By 1932, he had signed with Paramount Pictures and changed his name. Archibald Leach became Cary Grant. The studio had suggested the name. He had agreed without argument. He was 28 years old, and he was beginning to understand that Archibald Leach was a problem that Cary Grant could solve. What you have heard so far is nothing compared to what this name change actually cost him. Because here is what nobody talks about when they tell the Cary Grant story. Changing your name in Hollywood in 1932 was not unusual. Dozens of actors did it. But for Archie, it was not administrative. It was surgical. He was not adopting a stage name. He was attempting to kill someone. The boy from Bristol. The boy whose mother had disappeared. The boy who had stood in that kitchen at 9 years old and absorbed the lesson that love was something that left without warning. Cary Grant did not have that history. Cary Grant had been born in 1932, fully formed, in a Paramount Pictures office. Cary Grant had no mother who had been taken away. Cary Grant had no father who had poured tea without looking up. Cary Grant had no 9-year-old self sitting at a kitchen table trying to figure out what he had done wrong. Archie Leach had all of those things. And Archie Leach was gone. For 30 years, it worked. For 30 years, Cary Grant was the most effortlessly appealing man in American cinema. He made it look like ease. He made it look like something he had been born with rather than something he had constructed piece by piece from the wreckage of a childhood in Bristol. Alfred Hitchcock said he was the only actor who could be funny and frightening in the same frame. Katharine Hepburn said he was the most technically accomplished actor she had ever worked with, and she said it as a compliment and a caution at the same time, because she understood that technical accomplishment of that order comes from practice, and practice of that order comes from need. But wait, do not miss this detail. In 1958, Cary Grant did something that no Hollywood star of his generation had done publicly. He underwent LSD therapy. This was not recreational. This was not fashionable, though it would become fashionable in a few years. This was desperate. He was 54 years old, and he had been married 3 times, and each marriage had collapsed in ways that he could not entirely explain, and he had begun to understand that the pattern was not coincidence. His psychiatrist had suggested a new treatment, lysergic acid diethylamide, administered in a clinical setting, under supervision. Grant agreed. He did not talk publicly about what happened in those sessions for years. When he finally did, he described it in terms that were almost clinical in their precision and almost unbearable in what they revealed. He said that in those sessions he had cried for the first time since he was a child. He said that he had found somewhere beneath all of it the 9-year-old boy from Bristol that he had spent 30 years trying to bury. He said, with the careful phrasing of a man who has thought very hard about how to say something, that Cary Grant had been a performance, and that the performance had been for most of his life the only thing keeping him together. He said, "I was finally able to cry." 3 words. I was finally able to cry. From the most charming man in the history of Hollywood. From the man who had made laughing look like breathing. From the man who had been performing ease so long that he had almost forgotten there was a person underneath it. In October of 1968, Cary Grant walked onto the Tonight Show stage for one of the rarest appearances of his late career. He was 64 years old. He had been retired from film for 2 years. He had recently married Diane Cannon, his 4th wife, and they had a daughter, Jennifer, who was 2 years old. He was, by every external measure, at peace. He sat down across from Johnny Carson and crossed his legs and smiled that smile, and the studio audience made the sound that studio audiences made when Cary Grant smiled at them, the sound of people who cannot quite believe their luck. Johnny had prepared, as he always prepared. He had note cards. He knew about the retirement, about the new life, about the baby daughter. He had questions ready about the films, about Hitchcock, about what it felt like to step away from one of the great careers in Hollywood history. These were good questions. They were the questions any reasonable interviewer would have asked. And then something happened that was not on Johnny's note card. Something shifted in the room. Later, people who were in the studio that night would struggle to describe it. It was not anything Cary Grant did. It was something in his expression when he sat down, a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was performance. This was something else. This was a man who was trying to decide something. Johnny felt it. Johnny Carson had been doing this for 6 years at that point, and he had the gift, the rare and unteachable gift of reading the actual temperature of a room rather than the performed temperature. He looked at Cary Grant sitting across from him and he set down his note card. He did not reach for the prepared questions about Hitchcock or the baby or the retirement. He leaned forward slightly and he said 4 words. "Tell me about yourself." And Cary Grant stopped. 47 seconds. The orchestra had finished its introduction, and the audience had settled, and the cameras were rolling, and 40 million Americans were watching at home, and Cary Grant sat in the guest chair on The Tonight Show and said nothing. His hands, which were always still, were not quite still. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something that no one in that studio had ever seen Cary Grant's eyes do, which was fill. Then he said, quietly, into the microphone, so quietly that the people in the back rows would later say they had to lean forward to hear it. "My name is Archibald Leach." The studio did not react immediately. Not because people were not moved, but because people were not sure what they had heard. Johnny Carson, who had kept his composure through 1,000 unexpected moments, sat very still. He recognized what he was witnessing. He had the wisdom not to interrupt it. "I have been Cary Grant for 36 years, Grant continued. His voice was even. It had the evenness of someone who has rehearsed a thing without realizing they were rehearsing it. And for most of those 36 years, I had no idea what that meant. I thought I had left Archie behind. I thought that was what you did. You left the old version behind, and you became the new version, and the old version simply ceased to exist." He paused. "He does not cease to exist." Johnny said nothing. The studio said nothing. 300 people sat in the particular silence that descends when something true is being said in public. "My mother was taken away when I was 9, Grant said. Not in those words. They said she had gone for a rest. I was 31 years old before I found out where she had actually been. 31 years old. I was already Cary Grant by then. I was already in the films. And I drove to that institution in Bristol, and I walked in, and there was an old woman in a chair by the window, and I did not recognize her. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at this old woman, and I thought, this is a mistake. They have shown me to the wrong room. And then she turned her face toward me, and I knew." He stopped again. He was not performing the stopping. That was the thing about it that the people in that studio would carry with them. He was not performing any of it. "I had been so busy becoming someone else," Grant said, "that I had not thought about what she had lost. She had lost her son, not to death, to ambition, to Hollywood, to a name that was not the name she had given him." Johnny Carson's hand was flat on the desk. He was leaning forward very slightly. "I went back to London after that," Grant continued, "and I started, for the first time, trying to understand what I had done. Not what had been done to me, what I had done. Because the boy from Bristol did not disappear. I just stopped looking at him. And when you stop looking at something that is alive, it does not die. It waits." The studio was absolutely still. "I have a daughter now," Grant said. "Jennifer. She is 2 years old, and I have been sitting here tonight, thinking about what I am going to tell her when she is old enough to ask. I am going to tell her my real name. I am going to tell her about Hewenden Road, and her grandmother, and the kitchen, and the morning when the house went quiet. I am not going to hand her a character to love. I am going to let her know the person." He looked at Johnny. "I should have done that with everyone I ever loved," he said. "I did not. I gave them Cary Grant instead, and Cary Grant is very good company. But you cannot be loved by someone who does not know you exist." The silence that followed lasted longer than the silence after most things said on television. When the applause finally came, it was not the applause of an audience entertained. It was the applause of an audience that had just been given permission for something. The permission to be, underneath whatever name they had chosen for themselves, the person they had always actually been. Johnny Carson looked at his desk for a long time before he spoke. When he looked up, his eyes were not dry. "Mr. Leach," he said it deliberately. He said it as a gift. "It is a genuine honor to finally meet you." The camera caught Cary Grant's face in the moment that followed. In 36 years of being filmed, across hundreds of films and interviews and photographs, there is no image of Cary Grant that looks like this one. He is not performing. He is not composing. He is simply a man who has just been seen, possibly for the first time, and who does not quite know yet what to do with that. He said, very quietly, "Thank you." That was all. 2 words. But they were the truest 2 words he had spoken in public since 1932. What happened after that night has been recorded in fragments. People who were in the studio described it for years afterward. Crew members who had worked The Tonight Show for a decade said they had never seen anything like it. Not the dramatic things, not the tears, not the famous names. This quiet dismantling on camera of a performance that had lasted 36 years. Cary Grant gave very few interviews after 1968. He had never given many, but the ones he gave in the years that followed had a different quality. He talked about Jennifer with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who had decided that one person at least would know him. He talked about his mother with the careful sorrow of someone who has done the work of understanding rather than the easier work of forgetting. He talked about Bristol occasionally, about Hewenden Road, about the smell of the terraced houses in the morning. He did not, as far as anyone can find, ever again describe himself primarily as Cary Grant when asked who he was. He would say the name. Of course he would say the name. The name was real by then, as real as any name becomes when it has been carried long enough. But there was a quality in the saying of it that had changed, as though the name were now a thing he wore rather than a thing he was, as though underneath it, with some effort, you could still find the boy from Bristol. He married a 5th time, in 1981, to Barbara Harris. He was 77 years old. People who knew them said it was the most at ease they had ever seen him. He died on November 29, 1986, in Davenport, Iowa, hours after the curtain came down on a one-man show he had been performing called A Conversation with Cary Grant. He died in character, in the most literal possible sense, but the people who had known him in the last years said that for the first time, the character and the man were not entirely separate things. His daughter Jennifer said something in the years after his death that stopped everyone who heard it. She said that her father had told her when she was old enough to understand that his real name was Archibald Leach. She said he had told her about Hewenden Road and her grandmother and the kitchen. She said he had not handed her a character to love. She said that what he had given her instead was the person. He had kept his promise, the one he had made on camera in the autumn of 1968 in a studio in Burbank, to a television host who had asked him 4 simple words and waited for the answer. Johnny Carson kept that broadcast date written in a small notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. Not the episode notes, not the show record, just the date. October the 15th, 1968. When people asked why that date mattered, he said it was the night he had learned something about interviewing and about listening and about what happens when you ask the simplest question and then have the patience to wait. He said, "I asked him to tell me about himself. I thought I was asking Cary Grant. The man who answered was someone I had never met before, and he was magnificent." If this story reached something in you, take a moment before you close this video. Think about the name you answer to, and whether it is entirely yours, and whether the person underneath it has had a chance recently to be seen. You do not need a television studio. You do not need 40 million people watching. You just need one person who is willing to ask and then wait. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, because these stories are traveling further than I ever expected, and I want to know where the truth is landing. Where are you watching from? Drop your city, your name, your country below. And if you have ever, even once, introduced yourself by a name that was not entirely your own, tell us about the person underneath it. We want to know them too. Disclaimer: this story is a work of narrative fiction created for entertainment purposes. While inspired by real public figures and historical settings, all events, dialogue, and interactions are imagined and do not depict real interviews or documented occurrences. Any resemblance to actual events or private conversations is purely fictional. There is something else that needs to be said about that night. Something that the broadcast record does not capture and that the camera could not fully convey. After the applause died down and the commercial brake light came on and the crew began their routine movements across the studio floor, Cary Grant did not move. He sat in the guest chair with his hands folded in his lap, and he looked at the middle distance, and the people close enough to see his face said he had an expression they could not name. Not relief, exactly. Not grief, exactly. Something in between. Something that looked like a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down and is not yet sure whether he is grateful or simply exhausted. Johnny Carson came around the desk during the break. He did not say anything remarkable. He sat in the chair next to Grant that the stage manager had pulled forward, and he offered him a glass of water, and Grant took it, and they sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have just been through something together. The crew moved around them with the careful discretion of people who have learned over years of live television when to give a moment its space. Ed McMahon, who had been at Johnny's side for every broadcast since the first, said afterward that he had watched 1,000 things happen on that stage. He had watched people cry and confess and collapse and perform their way through grief and anger and love and fear. He had watched things that were real and things that were performed and things that were both at once. He said that in his experience there was a quality to something real that you could not fake and could not manufacture and could not teach yourself to recognize. You simply knew it when you saw it. He said that what happened in that chair with Cary Grant was the most real thing he had ever seen on that stage. He said it without qualification. He said it was not close. But what you have seen so far is nothing compared to what Cary Grant did after the cameras went back on. Because the second half of that broadcast, the half that came after the commercial break, after Grant had set down the water glass and composed himself and recrossed his legs and allowed the smile to return, was different from the first half in a way that the people who watched it at home noticed without being able to say precisely why. He was still charming. He was still precise. He still had all the qualities that had made him the most watchable man in American cinema. But there was something added to those qualities that had not been there before. A transparency. A sense that what you were seeing was not entirely performance. That somewhere underneath the charm, if you looked carefully, you could see the shape of Archie Leach looking back at you. A woman who had been in the studio audience that night wrote a letter to NBC 2 days later. She was a housewife from Pasadena. She was not famous, and she was not connected, and she had no particular reason for her letter to survive, but it did. She wrote that she had gone to the Tonight Show taping expecting to see Cary Grant, and had come home feeling as though she had met someone she had known all her life. She wrote that she did not know how to explain this except to say that something true had been said, and that true things travel differently than performed things, and that she had felt it in the room before she had understood what it was. She wrote that she had cried on the way home, not from sadness, but from the specific emotion that comes when you realize you are not the only person who has been performing. She wrote, in the last paragraph of her letter, "I have been answering to a name for 40 years that I chose when I was 20 because the name I was given felt like too much to carry. I have never told anyone this. I am telling you now because a man on television tonight reminded me that the person underneath the name does not disappear just because you stop looking at them. I am going to look at her again. I wanted someone to know." NBC received 412 letters in the week following that broadcast. This was unusual for a Thursday night episode with no major news event attached to it. The letters came from places The Tonight Show did not normally hear from small towns in Nebraska and Louisiana and Montana, from people who were not fans of Cary Grant specifically, who had watched because the television was on or because their wife had wanted to see it or because they had fallen asleep and woken up in the middle of it. They wrote about their own names, their own reinventions, their own buried versions of themselves. They wrote about mothers and fathers and the particular silence of houses where certain truths were never spoken. They wrote about the feeling of being seen, which is not the same as being famous and not the same as being liked and is in many ways more rare than either. This is the thing about honesty spoken in public. It does not stay in the room where it was spoken. It travels. It finds the people who needed to hear it. And it reminds them of things they have been working very hard to forget. It does not ask permission, and it does not observe the usual boundaries of celebrity and audience. It simply arrives, in living rooms and kitchens, and on the drive home from a television studio in Pasadena, and it does what honest things do. It makes you feel less alone. Now, before I let you go, I want to say something directly to you, because if you have watched this far, if you have stayed with this story all the way to this moment, then I do not think it is only because you are interested in Cary Grant. I think it is because something in this story touched something in you. Some version of a name you carry, some version of a person underneath the name who has not had enough space lately, some memory of a kitchen gone quiet, or a question unanswered, or a version of yourself that you left somewhere along the road and have not quite gone back to find. That person is still there. The same way Archie Leach was still there underneath 60 years of Cary Grant. Still there, still waiting, still carrying everything that happened on Hughenden Road in 1914 and everything that happened after it. Still capable, even at the very end, of sitting in a chair and saying, "My name is Archibald Leach." Still capable of being met. You do not need a Tonight Show stage. You do not need 40 million people watching. You do not need to wait until you are 64 years old and sitting across from Johnny Carson with the studio lights on, and the cameras rolling and the world paying attention. You can do it in a conversation. You can do it in a letter. You can do it in the comments section of a YouTube video at whatever hour you are watching this, in whatever city, with whatever name you have been answering to. We want to know who you actually are. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And if this one meant something to you, share it with one person who needs to hear it tonight. You will know who that person is. You have probably been thinking about them this whole time. I want to thank you for being part of this channel and this community. Your support, your membership, your presence in these comments is the reason these stories get to be told. If you have not yet joined as a member, the link is below. Members get early access and exclusive content and the knowledge that they are directly making these stories possible. But more than that, membership is how this channel stays independent. No sponsors, no advertisers, just you and these stories and the people who need to hear them. Thank you. And wherever you are watching from, whatever name you are carrying tonight, I hope this story gave you something to carry alongside it.